just coming back to self-efficacy then, the biggest gains are in self-regulated learning confidence.
Yes.
Why does that matter? Like, why is that important?
Yeah. So this is probably the place to talk.
You want me to put the stats up because we've got them on this one.
Can we come to that in a moment? Can we go back a step first of all, because we'll keep it clear.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a second here about cases. So particularly in the US, there's a tool that's used to measure academic self-efficacy. And that tool is called CASES, and it's 30-something questions, and the students just rate themselves 0 to 5 on their confidence with particular tasks. And then CASES is a score, it's a total score, which reflects your academic self-efficacy. And one of the first things we did as researchers looking at CASES was to break it down a bit before we'd actually run any of those surveys, because we felt like there were domains within the CASES questions. We felt there were 5 types of questions there, and some were around how you manage your learning, and some were around who you are as a person. And we touched on this a moment ago. We did not think it was likely that who you are as a person is going to change in 12 weeks from having access to a disability support tool for, the vast majority of people. But we were thinking that if we were going to see changes, we would likely see them around this idea of self-regulated learning and cognitive indicators starting to think differently about studying. So you're self-regulated, you're managing how you study. These are the questions like, I am confident taking notes in a lecture. This is, I can manage my study time. These skills-based questions or self-regulation-based questions about managing the resource of yourself and your attention in a complex environment. So what we have proposed, and this is an ongoing piece of research between myself and Genio, is that CASES actually has what we're calling proximal, or like short-term changes, and distal, long-term changes. And in this kind of intervention analysis, the short-term changes are probably more interesting to us because it helps us understand where Genio is having an impact quite quickly. So if we switch across to the next slide, this is a heat map that we produced. Now, it looks very complicated and noisy, and what I want you to think about is let's start off by thinking about the impact groups. So over the studied period, most of the users increased their self-efficacy by some amount, by a statistically significant amount. But of course, not everybody uses the tool in the same ways. So some people who most often were issued the tool without any onboarding, they're not using it very much. So we call them inactive users. And you can see that the inactive users, they make less progress in academic self-efficacy. The active users, they make a bit more progress in self-efficacy, and the proactive users make the most progress in self-efficacy. So we have what we call a graduated interval of change, whether you're not using it at all, using it a little bit, or using it a lot and in depth. So we created user metrics that broke the 480 something users in the study into these groups. Now, where it gets really interesting is we get these themes. So as well as the quantitative data, their CASES score, which went up for 70-ish% of the users, we also asked them some qualitative questions. So we asked them to respond, like, in what ways do you think this is doing, this is helping you with this specific thing? And from their responses, the users are really quite passionate about the difference that Genio is making for them, which is really interesting. My background is primarily as a qualitative researcher. So one of the tools we have in qualitative research is thematic analysis. Forgive me. One of the tools we have in qualitative research is thematic analysis. And thematic analysis allows us to analyze text and identify themes. So the themes that we have tend to, they're not necessarily linear, but there are particular themes that arise. The one that I think is most interesting is around anxiety. And what we see is a lot of students are saying, I historically am worried about going to class. I'm worried about missing things. I'm worried I'm not going to be able to manage, for whatever reason, additional need related, to get my notes down, to capture things, to understand things. And what they tell us in the qualitative data is, knowing I'll be able to record it I go to class less anxious. So they're arriving in classes or lectures calmer, more relaxed, more confident before the lecture's even begun, which I think is an incredibly powerful thing to discover about your product, right? Just having it is like that sense of security and confidence that we talked about, emotional self-regulation, looking at the data. What we also see is that this often leads on to engagement. Now, engagement, we're not using engagement in the sense of, oh, look, it's all shiny and we're all excited. We're using engagement in terms of cognitive engagement. So to take a couple of direct examples from the data, I go to class knowing I'll be able to capture the lecture notes, I'm paraphrasing, and I feel less anxious. Because I'm less anxious, I can listen. That's an enormously powerful transition. Because they're emotionally more regulated, they're able to engage intellectually, cognitively with the conversation. They're able to ask the question they want to ask because they're not worrying about trying to get everything written down. And engagement then leads us forward into study strategies. So this is where we see users using tools like Quiz.me, in Genio, where they're able to self-test and self-assess and get that positive feedback. And if we think back to what we were saying about academic self-efficacy and it resting on previous positive experience, this is where we start to get some really good stuff cooking up. So just explaining this heat map that's been on the screen for a minute now, this is co-occurrence of themes. If you look at the anxiety theme, you'll see that in the active and proactive users, it very rarely occurs by itself. So typically what we see, even if the student doesn't say because this then that, they say something about emotional self-regulation, and then they say something in another comment about I can listen, I can engage. And students who do both of those things tend to then in the proactive group go on and say, because I listened and was able to ask the question, I could then review those notes and understand what was going on and test myself. So that's why the co-occurrence is interesting. The inactive group is kind of a control, really. Some of them are still doing some of this stuff and saying some of this stuff. Even if they're not using the tool very much, they are still writing about it. But that hot heat map in the proactive group between engagement and strategy use, that I think is really telling. And it's another little puzzle, another little thread to follow that suggests how people using the tool depends on the ability to regulate themselves emotionally and not have that fear factor going on.
Amazing, fantastic. That was truly, truly wonderful. I'm just super conscious of time. So if anyone had any questions, if they've got comments in the chat, we can make sure they get the link to be able to get access to the study. But just really important to say that, the more students use Genio Notes, the more we saw shifts in these co-occurrence in these domains. And yeah, we're just very thankful that you were able to join us on this project, Laura, and deliver these insights for us.
It was a real pleasure. Can we do one more slide? Have we got time? I always want to explain a bit more.